Yá'át'ééh, Bene. Good morning, my relatives. It's Mark Charles. Today is Monday, October 27th. I'm sitting here with my second cup of coffee, and I'm excited after taking a bit of a break. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but I'm excited to be back with you and to have a conversation about some of the things going on in our world today. Uh, so on September 25th in 2025, just about a month ago, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, announced the final decision on the Medals of Honor for Wounded Knee, stating in a video that those soldiers deserve those medals and their place in our nation's history is no longer up for debate. I'll share the link to its full statement in a few minutes, but today I want to explore the shock and denial that's behind this decision and why, from both sides of the aisle, our nation is unable to face this history. I believe it's a symptom of a much deeper wound, and I want to talk about that wound and the best ways we can begin to address it. So I invite you to grab your second cup of coffee or whatever your favorite morning beverage is and join me for a discussion. Before I begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., but these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the host peoples of the land where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbling it is to be living, breathing, moving, existing on these lands today. So my Piscataway relatives, Ahiahat, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. It's been a little while since I've been on, so let me see who's joining me this morning. I see there's a few people who are on with me live streaming. Thank you so much for being a part of my second cup of coffee today. I've had about 3 or 4 weeks where I haven't done an episode, and part of that has been intentional, and part of that has been I've been fairly busy. As you know, we moved about a month and a half ago, and we're in a new house. We're still in DC, but we're in a new house, and so that's kind of left a lot of things very busy around our house. But I've also been doing a lot of work on my book that I'm working on, the book Decolonizing Faith. And I've made a lot of progress over the past few months. I've kind of worked out a new workflow that I'm really able to be very productive in. And I'm excited about that, but I've devoted a lot of that energy into getting that book proposal out so that I can actually know how I'm going to get the book published and begin working towards an actual deadline to getting that book out there. I'm very excited about that progress, and it's taken up a lot of my time these past few weeks. I also have been pondering, as you know, we're in a very chaotic moment. We've been in a very chaotic moment for quite a while, actually. But we have a government shutdown going on. We have our nation, our military is bombing drug dealers in international waters. The White House is deploying National Guard troops to Democratic-led cities around the country, including where I live, Washington, D.C. Just walked past a few National Guard members when I was walking around this weekend. And it's things we didn't expect our nation would be doing. I don't know why we wouldn't expect it. I mean, some of us maybe have been, but it's shocking and it's chaotic. And no one seems to be willing or able to engage in meaningful dialogue about what's going on. And it's turned into a partisan, bickering, screaming, fighting match, and no one has a solution. Everyone's just using this opportunity to demonize their opponent and raise money for their fundraising. And right, this is all about winning elections and raising money. It's not about actually solving our nation's problems. And so I've been very intentional as I've been thinking through what's been going on about how can I be in my work less reactive, more responsive, responding reflectively based on what's going on, and really trying to deal with the deeper issues of what's happening around our nation. And that's what I want to do today. So that's what I'm working on today. And so I have been planning this episode for the past 3 or 4 weeks. As you know, it was September 25th when Pete Hegseth first made this decision that we were not going to rescind the Medals of Honor. And this has long since left the news cycle, but I think there's some things we need to talk about here because I think if we can understand what's going on with this thing, it gives us greater insight to know what's going on in the broader scope of things. So that's my goal here, my relatives. So thank you for joining me for the discussion, and we'll see what we can uncover here. I want to start by reading the quote that Pete Hegseth gave, and I will put it up on the screen so you can see it as well. But I want to just read, this was, he posted a video on X on September 25th when he announced his decision about these medals. And this is what he said. He said, under the previous administration, a review panel was convened to determine whether soldiers awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions in the Battle at Wounded Knee should keep their medals. Now, upon deliberation, that panel concluded that these brave soldiers should, in fact, rightfully keep their medals from actions in 1890. The report was concluded on October of 2024, yet despite this clear recommendation, former Secretary Lloyd Austin, for whatever reason, I think we all know he was more interested in being politically correct than historically correct, chose not to make a final decision. Such careless inaction has allowed their distinguished recognition to remain in limbo until now. Under my direction, this again is Pete Hegseth, under my direction, we're making it clear without hesitation that the soldiers who fought in the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 will keep their medals. And we're making it clear that they deserve those medals. This decision is now final, and their place in our nation's history is no longer up for debate. We salute their memory, we honor their service, and we will never forget what they did. Now, if you want to watch that video yourself, I'm going to put the link into the chat here, and you are welcome to watch that video. I gave you the text of what he said in that video. And if you want to read a story about it, I'll share with you a link in AP News that also addresses the decision and that quote. So what do we do with this? I mean, he says some pretty, we're making it clear they deserve these medals. He is what he said. And we salute their memory. We honor their service. We'll never forget what they did. He also says in this that that I think talking about former Secretary of Defense, now Department of War, Lloyd Austin, he said, for whatever reasons, I think we know he was more interested in being politically correct than historically correct. And so clearly, Pete Hegseth and the Trump administration believe that history concludes that these soldiers deserve the Medal of Honor. So I want to take a look at this. Well, first I want to talk about a quote. There's a quote I want to share with you. It's a pretty fascinating quote. It was by Morgan Housel. Morgan Housel is an author who wrote a book called The Psychology of Money. He also wrote several other books, just came out with another book recently called The Art of Spending Money. And he's a very good author, and he's written several really good books. I've read two, or I'm reading his third book now. But he tweeted something in 2021 that gave a quote that he has since incorporated into his writing. He's used it in the book about sameness. I forget the title of that book. And he used it also in his book, The Art of Spending Money. But his tweet in 2021 said, my brother-in-law is a social worker working with neglected kids and just told me all behavior makes sense with enough information. People do crazy things because it makes sense to them, even if it doesn't make sense to us. And he said this applies to a lot of things. He since kind of expanded or clarified that a little bit more and said, all behavior, all decisions make sense with enough context. Basically, the person acting out the behavior, making the decision, is making a decision that makes sense to them And if you can understand their context, understand the information that they're working with, you can see how or why they're coming to the conclusion to make that behavior or to make that decision. He's not saying it justifies the decision. He's not saying it means it's a good decision or an accurate decision, but with enough context and information, you begin to understand why people make the decisions that they're making or enact the behaviors that they're enacting. And so I think if we're looking at this quote by Pete Hegseth and the broader policies of the Trump administration, which is reflecting the direction of our nation, I mean, let's not kid ourselves, right? President Trump was elected by a majority of U.S. voters. He was very clear about what he was going to do in the second term, very clear where he stood, very clear how he felt about things. It's not a surprise what he's doing right now, whether it's with these medals of honor or whether it's with Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, or whether it's about undocumented immigrants coming up from Mexico, as well as undocumented immigrants coming from white European nations, right? He was very clear what he was going to stand for, what he was going to do, and who he was going to favor. And so let's not pretend what's happening right now is a shock. And let's also not try to cover up the fact that this is what the nation wanted. A majority of U.S. voters said, this is what we want. We heard his vision. We had 4 years of experience with him prior. This is what we want. And so I think the question we have to make is not only why is Hegseth and Trump advocating for these types of policies, but why is the nation voting and approving and desiring these types of policies and qualities? Let's start by just looking at Wounded Knee. In 2017, I published an article. It was on my blog, Reflections from the Hogan. It also got published, I think, on a few other websites, maybe Native News Online. I think Indian Z or Indian Country Today might have published a draft of it as well. I'm going to put a link for it here into the chat. But it's titled The Massacre at Wounded Knee and the 18 Medals of Dishonor. And in that article, I go through the story of what happened at Wounded Knee. I also do the same thing in this book, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, where I talk about that massacre and what happened there. And at Wounded Knee, right, this was in 1890s, the U.S. Army was negotiating the surrender of several Lakota chiefs. And they were meeting at Wounded Knee. And both sides were very heavily armed. Excuse me, someone's spamming our comments here, and I'm going to remove them and block them. There. And so both sides were very heavily armed. Neither side trusted one another. And from the research I've done, no one knows who fired the first shot. No one knows, but a shot was fired. And chaos just broke out, right? A battle just broke out. Now, Wounded Knee happened at a part of what's now South Dakota, where there was a ravine, and there was kind of a riverbed that ran through this ravine. And the U.S. Army had several what are called these Hotchkiss cannons. These were large cannons. They could shoot several rounds. They were accurate up to a few hundred yards. And they began literally raining down bullets. And it wasn't just Native warriors who were there at these negotiations. There were Native families, there were women, there were children, there were elders there. And when the firing began breaking out, many of the Native people ran into the ravine to seek shelter from these guns from above that were raining down these bullets. And after the massacre was over, we awarded 18, some have said up to 20 medals of honor for this massacre. Now, I did some research and I looked and found why these medals were given and what was the reason for them. And I found Three of the medals, the one for William G. Austin, the one for John Gresham, and the one for Albert McMillan. William G. Austin was given this medal for the reason of while the Indians were concealed in a ravine, assisted men in the skirmish line, directing their fire, etc., and using every effort to dislodge the enemy. John Grisham was given the medal because he voluntarily led a party into a ravine to dislodge Sioux Indians concealed therein. He was wounded during this action. Albert McMillan was given this medal because while engaged with the Indians concealed in a ravine, he assisted the men on the skirmish line, directed their fire, encouraged them by example, and used every effort to dislodge the enemy. Now, I need to remind you, this was not just warriors who were in this ravine. There were women and there were children in that ravine, and these men were awarded the Medal of Honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest medal that you can get in our U.S. military, for dislodging women and children out of a ravine so they could be mowed down by the guns up above. Pete Hegseth said we were going to honor the correct history. This was a massacre, and these soldiers were committing war crimes. These are war crimes. See, we're asking the wrong questions. We're having discussion on whether or not they deserve a Medal of Honor. The question is, why did this nation not indict and dishonorably discharge these men for the horrific actions at this battle? Why was our military massacring women and children? That's the conversation we should be having, not the conversation of do they deserve a medal. No, that's not even a question. Clearly, they don't deserve a medal. The question is, why did we not dishonorably discharge these men and their commanders who were leading this massacre? That's the question we need to be asking. We're having the whole wrong conversation here. Again, all behaviors, all decisions make sense if you have enough information, if you understand the context well enough. There's a book that I read a couple years ago. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. It's by Bessel van der Kolk. Best-selling book. Fascinating book on trauma. It goes in depth about how trauma affects your memories, your psyche, your mental health, your body, your relationships. It's this all-encompassing condition that has these symptoms that occur in almost every aspect of the person who's been traumatized in their lives. And the book does an amazing job of laying out observations and understandings of that trauma and what it does to the body. And the body keeps the score. Why? Because the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial, where your body, in an effort to preserve itself, goes into a state of shock and denial because it doesn't know what to do with the overload of trauma or information or damage that it's experiencing. And you go literally into shock and denial, where you deny and can't understand what happened or why you behaved that way or what even is going on. I need to warn you, as we're going to be talking about these things, we're going to be talking about not just about this massacre, about many other things in the psychological field. And some of this may be triggering for people. And so I want to encourage people that if things get said in this podcast that are triggering, please seek professional help. Please find a trusted place where you can explore the things that you're experiencing. But we have to have these conversations because we need to understand what's going on within our nation right now. And so in his book, The Body Keeps a Score, he looks at what trauma does to a person's body, to a person's mental health, to a person's relationships, to a person's actions and their memories and everything else, how it has these impacts all across their systems. And he gives many, many examples. There's an article by Bessel van der Kolk as well. I'm going to share this in the chat. Let me put this in there. I found this the other day as I was doing my research for this podcast. And the article is titled "The Story of the PTSD Diagnosis." It's titled "The Politics of Mental Health." And in this, he talks about how PTSD, the diagnosis, came about. And it really happened after Vietnam, the Vietnam War, where we had so many soldiers coming back from this war, and they were suffering huge psychological and mental challenges that they were not able to fit back into mainstream society nearly as easily as soldiers from past wars had done, or at least had happened before. And so there began to be a looking at what's going on and how do we begin to treat and understand these patients. And this is where the post-traumatic stress and the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis actually developed, was out of this understanding. And in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk goes into depth in several of these soldiers' stories of what happened to them in Vietnam. And one of the stories that he shares, he has a whole chapter looking specifically at Vietnam, where he shares about a soldier who came back from the war and was not able to fit back into his family again. He had a wife, he had a child, and he was really wrestling to be present with them, and was getting more and more disconnected and more isolated, and was looking for help. And in the process of getting counseling, the trauma that he experienced was where he saw not only some of his closest friends, but members of his platoon just shot right in front of his eyes in some very brutal ways. And the trauma of what that did to him, and the pain that caused him, and the confusion and the shock and denial that sent him into. But that wasn't the only thing that was behind his disconnect when he returned home. What else was behind that disconnect was in response to seeing that pain, experiencing that pain, and seeing that violence enacted on his fellow soldiers. He went out and just went into a village and began massacring the people there, shooting children, killing people, committing crimes that were unthinkable for him. And came back not only in shock about what happened to his friend, but in shock about what he did and how he responded to that. And this was not an isolated story. This was not an isolated incident. And in our book, Unsettling Truths, we talk about the challenge in chapters 9 and 10, which are two of the hardest chapters to read. And these chapters look very closely at Abraham Lincoln and who Abraham Lincoln was, how he was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, and one of the most ethnic cleansing and genocidal presidents in our nation's history, which is completely contrary to the narrative we have of him, which is he is our greatest president who was a hero for our country and who held our union together through the Civil War, and who loved people of color and freed and abolished slavery, right? This is the myth we have of him. And we looked at the adage that says the victors write the history. And, right, no one disputes that. If you win a war, you get to write about the war. You get to control the narrative about the war. And Vietnam was unique because we didn't lose the war per se, right? We didn't get a regime change here on our homelands. We didn't lose the war. We didn't lose land. We didn't win the war. We pulled out of Vietnam, but we didn't lose it. We didn't get disarmed as a nation. We didn't have a regime change within our government, within our people, right? We didn't lose in that respect. Whereas in previous wars, World War II, World War I, many of our other wars that we fought, we won those wars. And so we were able to control the narrative. And so the soldiers coming back from World War II, for example, they were coming back as heroes, right? We had defeated Japan, who bombed us at Pearl Harbor. We had defeated Nazi Germany, who were committing the Holocaust against Jewish people. And our soldiers were coming back as heroes. And our Vietnam soldiers were not coming back as heroes. There was a lot of divide about the war and should we even be in this war? And then we didn't really win the war. And so they were coming back, and it was at best a lukewarm, if not a hostile reception for the soldiers who were coming back. And not only had they suffered the trauma of being in a war and being shot at and and experiencing all this violence, but they had also been participating in the violence. Some in ways that are appropriate for war, and in other ways, like was just described, in ways that were completely inappropriate for war, and had been committing war crimes. And so it's not surprising to me that the PTSD diagnosis was developed after the Vietnam War and after that was over, because we weren't able to control the narrative nearly as well. It was much harder to create a mythology like we had done for ourselves in past wars, like we did for Abraham Lincoln. And so I don't want to go too deep into the weeds here, but our soldiers, there wasn't a positive narrative being written about what happened in Vietnam that they could rely back on to even justify what had happened during that war. And so many of them were left on their own to kind of sort through those things. And I think this is where PTSD was beginning to be developed, because we saw what was happening, and they weren't able to come back and fully engage in society. And we didn't even know as a nation how to welcome them back. And I think what was interesting in that is the PTSD diagnosis was coming out of that. But most frequently, when we look at PTSD, we think of the PTSD, the post-traumatic stress, is something that occurs for victims of a horrifying event. And in my book, I talk about PITS, which is identified by Rachel McNair in her work when she looks at perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which she says has all the same symptoms of a PTSD, but PTSD afflicts the victims, whereas PITS would afflict the perpetrator. And it was really interesting to me reading that article, because it's like, the PTSD diagnosis was looking at people who were actually experiencing both PTSD and PITS. Yes, they were victims of horrifying events, but yes, they were also perpetrating horrifying events, some within the boundaries of war and some very clearly outside the boundaries of war. And so it was interesting to me that it was being developed there. But for the first time, our nation was not able to control the narrative nearly as well. And the reason I say for the first time, because as we point out in Unsettling Truths, if you've read this book, the U.S. government, U.S. military, we've never lost a war that matters. We've won every major conflict we've ever been a part of. And yes, we pulled out of Vietnam. Technically, the Korean War is not over yet. We also pulled out of Afghanistan. But we've never lost land. We've never been invaded. We've never had a regime change. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've never lost a war in that respect. And as a result, we've by and large been able to control the narrative of almost every major military conflict that we've been a part of. And war crimes play a very heightened role in the United States military history. We perpetually commit war crimes over and over and over again. If you don't believe me, let's look at World War II. Again, in chapter 9, we talk about two men, Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. I won't go into the whole story. Robert McNamara was an analyst working in the Air Force under General LeMay, who was in charge of the Pacific Theater. He wasn't flying planes. He wasn't dropping bombs. He was an analyst. He was analyzing the bombs we were dropping and how effectively we were hitting our targets. And he noticed that we were flying our planes too high. They were being blown off course through the jet stream, and we were not hitting our targets. And he recommended to General LeMay that we might want to start flying our planes lower so they could be more accurate and hit their targets better. I want to read this quote to you from his writings on this. Let me pull this up really quick. Sorry. This is an interview by Robert McNamara. He said, I was on the island of Guam in his command, General LeMay, in March of 1945. In that single night, we burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo, men, women, and children. Question, were you aware this was going to happen? Robert McNamara, well, I was part of a mechanism that in a sense recommended it. I analyzed bombing operations and how we make them more efficient. Now, I don't want to suggest that it was my report that led to, I'll call it the firebombing. It's not that I'm trying to absolve myself of blame for the firebombing. I just don't want to suggest that I was the one. I don't want to suggest I was the one who put it in LeMay's mind that his operations were totally inefficient and had to be drastically changed. But anyhow, that's what he did. Tokyo was a wooden city, and when we dropped those firebombs, we just burned it, and we destroyed, killed, massacred 100,000 people in a single night. The most deadly night of bombing in the history of the world. More people in a single night than Nagasaki or Hiroshima. And he went on in this in his documentary called The Fog of War. This is what he said. He was wrestling with these decisions. He said the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with the rules of war. Was there a rule that said you shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a night? LeMay said if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. So Robert McNamara, who went on to serve as the Secretary of Defense, was the architect of Vietnam and the use of Agent Orange, is acknowledging that when he served under General LeMay in World War II, he and our nation were in effect committing war crimes. We were war criminals. We bombed 100,000 civilians in a single night, and that wasn't the only time we did it. Not only did we do it later with the dropping of nuclear bombs on 2 more cities in Japan, but we had been doing this throughout our nation's history. If you look at a map, this is the United States in 1840. The dark states on the east side of the map are established states. The lighter states to the west are territories or even uncharted lands. If you look up medals of honor, you can find them both by war and by year. And if you look at medals of honor for the Indian War campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, The United States military awards 425 medals of honor for soldiers who fought in the Indian War campaigns. At the end of that period, this is what our nation looked like, right? We've completed our manifest destiny. We've gone all the way across the continent. They now control this land from sea to shining sea. During that period, the 1800s, the majority U.S. population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million. And the native population collapsed from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing your math, that's a 61.47%. If you're comparing your math, that's a higher percentage than Hitler had over the Jews in Nazi Germany. So we have to acknowledge, between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 medals of honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. And we knew what we were doing. We absolutely knew what we were doing. In 1849, 1851, Peter Burnett, he was the first governor of California. In his State of the State address, this is what he said: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying famine's broken out and we can't feed these people. Nor is he saying disease has struck and we can't stop its spread. He is literally saying we cannot stop killing these people until we complete our manifest destiny. War crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide is how this happened. This is our nation's history. And we gave 425 medals of honor to the soldiers who participated in that ethnic cleansing, in that genocide, in that atrocity. We also did it in World War II. Robert McNamara acknowledged that he was committing war crimes. His general acknowledged they were committing war crimes. The question wasn't were they committing them, the question was were they going to get prosecuted for them. They knew they were committing them. Robert McNamara was given the Legion of Merit when he was discharged from the Army. And after serving as Secretary of Defense, he was given the Medal of Freedom. Yeah, our nation honors war criminals. Throughout our entire history, this is what we do. We honor. Not only do we not prosecute them, not only do we not discharge them, we honor war criminals. So when people like Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth talk about they're not going to be politically correct anymore, and they're going to be historically correct, it's very clear they're in a state of shock and denial. They don't know what to do with our nation's history. They don't know what to do with it. But since we've won so many of these wars, they are working their hardest to control the narrative. And remember, they're not acting alone. They're not acting alone. The majority of U.S. voters heard what Trump was about, knew what he wanted to do, understood his vision. We had 4 years prior of experience with him. We knew what he was going to do. And the majority of U.S. voters in 2024 said that's who we want leading this country. He was a convicted felon, is a convicted felon. And we said, we want a convicted felon leading our country and doing these things. This isn't a Trump problem that we're facing here. As much as the Democrats want us to believe it's a Trump problem, this is not a Trump problem. This is what we do as a nation. This is who we are, and we don't have a clue what to do with that. And so we're working as hard as we can to stay in a state of denial. And our denials are getting more and more brazen. Trump, right? After the optic of having a black man sitting in the Oval Office, the elected president of our nation, our country did not know what to do with that optic, because that was not how this nation was founded. That was not what our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution meant to give the right to and the access to. Right? We, the people, literally meant white landowning men. The Constitution counted Africans as 3/5 of a person. The Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. When they wrote those words, all men are created equal, and we, the people of the United States, they meant white men. So when our nation saw a black man sitting in the Oval Office, this is why we completely flipped. We elected Donald Trump to make America great again. And ever since then, he has been trying to prove that he's a better president, a better man than Barack Obama. Our nation doesn't know what to do with its history. In my book, I talk about PTSD and PITS. PTSD, post-traumatic stress. It's an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a horrifying event. It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. It's this all-encompassing condition. There's another diagnosis called a complex PTSD. Complex PTSD doesn't come from a single event. It comes from a series of events. If you get PTSD from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. If you get PTSD from living in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. Psychologists have observed, they don't know how it works, but they've observed the symptoms of a complex PTSD in the children and grandchildren of the people who experience the trauma. It gets passed down generationally. Then there's historical trauma. This is not an individual diagnosis. This is how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. It was first observed in the Native community after our history of boarding schools and removal. You can also see it in African American communities after enslavement or Jim Crow laws or segregation. You can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust. You can see it in Japanese American communities after the internment camps. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. And I'm very aware of that trauma and how it interplays within my audiences of people of color and people from the margins, both individually and communally. But the most disruptive demographic in these dialogues is not people of color. It's white people. White people are the ones who stand up in the middle of my lectures and call me a liar, even though I'm reading verbatim the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. White people are the ones who are intent on derailing these dialogues whenever we start to have them and make some progress in wrestling with our nation's history. And it was when I found the diagnosis, the research by Rachel McNair on perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which she demonstrates and diagnosis has all the same symptoms as a PTSD, except PTSD afflicts the victim, whereas PITS afflicts the perpetrator. And once I found her research and her work, I was able to hypothesize that if PTSD has a multi-generational and communal manifestation at a complex level that is known as historical trauma, then might not PITS also have a multi-generational and communal manifestation at a complex level, which is what I refer to as the trauma of white America. Yes, I interact with my white audiences as another group of traumatized people. Because as I've spoken about these topics over the past 15 to 20 years of my life, I have observed time and time and time again of my white audiences, both in a state of shock and denial, as well as doing everything they can to disrupt the conversations that we're trying to initiate around this history. And the denial is just getting more and more brazen. And this isn't just, again, this isn't just a right problem, right? This isn't just a conservative Republican problem. This is a bipartisan problem. After Trump began getting support and raising money and getting support for his election in 2022 or in 2016 to make America great again, Hillary Clinton didn't want to be left out. And so she told her supporters that America's already great. America's great already. At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumps into the fray. He's endorsing Hillary Clinton, and he says, America's already pretty great. Cory Booker, African-American senator from New Jersey, was on stage endorsing Hillary Clinton at the 2016 DNC. In his speech, he acknowledges that our Declaration calls women savage, calls Native savages. He acknowledges our Constitution excludes women. He acknowledges the Three-Fifths Compromise. And then he tells the white men of the Democratic Party that these things do not detract from America's greatness. He would never say that to a room full of black people. He would never say that to a room full of Native people. He would never say that to a room full of women. But he had to say it because the white landowning men in this country need to know that they're exceptional. Because if they're not, then they're just war criminals and they don't know what to do with that. In the general election in 2016, Hillary Clinton was debating Donald Trump. And she decided to expand on her point about America's greatness. And she said, not only is America great, but America is great because America is good. Donald Trump was wandering the stage the way he did during those debates, just going back and forth, doing any antic he could to get attention on himself. And he paused and turned and looked directly at Hillary Clinton and said, I agree with her. I agree with everything she just said. You see, we were duped in 2016. We thought we were debating racism versus anti-racism, equality versus inequality. We weren't. We were deciding, did we want Donald Trump and the Republicans to make us explicitly racist and sexist and white supremacists again? Or did we want the Democrats and Hillary Clinton to work to keep those traits implicit? And we voted for implicit, and the Electoral College gave us explicit. And then in 2020, in 2024, just to erase any doubt, we voted for explicit. The right doesn't have the solutions to, the right's not trying to solve these problems, and the left doesn't have the solutions. They don't. President Obama himself buried an apology to Native peoples that was tucked into the 2010 Defense Department Appropriations Act, House Resolution 3326, subsection 8113. Is titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific injustice. It says these natives, you had some nice lands. We didn't take those lands very politely. Why don't we all now just steward these lands together? And then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. Oh, but didn't Joe Biden apologize for boarding schools? He did. And then turned it into a campaign rally, forcing the people who were victimized at those schools to have to applaud for him. It was a despicable display. The Democrats could have rescinded these medals a long time ago. They didn't. Why? Because our nation does not know what to do with its history. It doesn't know what to do. We are a nation built on war crimes. And instead of wrestling with what we've done and the injustices we've enacted, we choose over and over and over again to elevate our war criminals and to honor them. Don't even get me started on Abraham Lincoln. So what do we do? What do we do? That's the problem. The left and the right are just screaming at each other, finding everything they can to demonize their opponent and to raise money from their bases. They are trying to win elections. They are not trying to solve our problems. This is the challenges that we're facing. When I ran for president in 2020, I was a part of a debate for independent third-party candidates. Didn't get nationally televised, but it was live streamed. And there was a candidate running at the time. His name was Vermin Supreme. He was an antics guy. He was doing a lot of things to draw attention to his campaign. During his speeches, he would play music, sing songs, tell off-the-wall jokes. He would use antics to draw attention to his campaign. He would dress up like a wizard and other things. He used antics. And during the debate, they put us all at a table and they asked questions, and then they would just go down the table and give answers. And I was sitting right next to Vermin Supreme. And every response he gave, right? He told jokes, he sang songs, he played music, he did sound effects, right? All of his antics was on full display every time he asked a question. And he was right before me. He was the person answering the question. They went the same method for every single question. And so I was after him every single question. And I had to decide, what am I going to do here? Right? Do I respond to his antics? Do I bring in my own antics? No, I had to recognize that while we were both running for president, we were using very different methods to try and get our messages across. And we were at a debate, and I don't think Vermin Supreme was debating. And so I couldn't engage with him in that way. And so every time he did his little show just before it came to me, I would have to take a breath, give it a slight pause, and go from what he was doing into a more in-depth analysis of what I think our nation was dealing with at its foundational core. And I did that time and time and time again. I came out of that debate with a greater respect for Vermin because he had some things he was literally trying to bring attention to, and he was working on. Again, all behavior makes sense with enough information. And at the end of the election, our end of the campaign, our end of the debate, we were standing behind, shaking hands and kind of greeting the other candidates there. He came up and told me how much he appreciated my responses. And he said he was going to vote for me. I loved it. I was like, yeah, that's what you got to do, right? Had I just turned it into a game of trying to top his antics, it would have devolved the whole thing into just a sideshow. But by staying on message, not criticizing him, not otherizing him, not mocking him for the way he was going about the debate, but by just staying on my message and talking about the things that I wanted to talk about and I knew needed to be discussed. Not only was I able to get my message out to the people watching the debate, but I was actually able to gain the support of the person right next to me who was engaging in all the distracting behavior. And so when I look at the antics of Donald Trump, and they are antics, when I look at the antics of Pete Hegseth, I don't want to respond to them. I don't want to play their game because they are playing a game that ultimately is going to be exposed as a game and a fraud. They're not dealing with reality. They're living in a state of shock and denial, and they don't know what to do with our nation's history. And so they're trying to recast it as something it's not. And if you look at the historical records, if you read what the medals were for, if you look at what happened in the battle, those soldiers, not only did they not deserve medals of honor, we need to ask, why were they not prosecuted? Why were they not dishonorably discharged for such behavior? And then in the broader context, we have to ask, not just, we have to ask, why do we choose to honor, as we've done time and time again with General LeMay and with Robert McNamara, with Abraham Lincoln, and with the 425 U.S. soldiers who participated in the Indian war campaigns? Why do we continue to honor our war criminals? Please hear me. I am not saying every Medal of Honor recipient is a war criminal. That's not what I'm saying. I am asking, why do we use this distinguished highest medal of honor in our nation's military? Why do we use it over and over and over again to honor war criminals? What is wrong with us? Because when you look at our history, over and over and over and over again, from the leadership down, we commit war crimes. It's written into our foundations. It's clear and blatant part of our history. Chapter 1 of this book, the first sentence of the first chapter says, you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize lands. You can't discover them unless your worldview, and better yet, your church, tells you the people living there are not fully human. Every time a land title case comes up for the Supreme Court, they do not reference a treaty. They do not say, based on this treaty that we have kept with this nation, we have rights to these lands. They don't say that. As recently as 2005, whenever a land title case comes up by the Supreme Court, they reference the doctrine of discovery because that's the only basis they have for claiming these lands. And we don't know what to do with that. And so our denials get more and more brazen. Our screaming gets louder and louder. Anything we can do from the left or the right to distract us from what we've actually done as a nation. We don't know what to do with our history. So as a Native man who knows this history, who's studied it, who's looked at it, I refuse to take part in the reactive screaming that goes on in our partisan politics. Right now, the Republicans are in charge. The Democrats are working desperately hard to change that. But the majority of US voters said this is what we want right now. The Republican Party is not holding Donald Trump accountable. He is making a fool of himself and us as a nation on the global stage. And US voters said that's what we want. The world knows what we've done. The world knows what we're doing. What our antics are blatantly obvious to anyone who's not a part of our trauma. We're only fooling ourselves here. And yet that's what we said we wanted. And so I don't want to scream at that. I don't want to join in that fight. I want to understand why it's there. I want to understand why we react the way we react, why we do the things we do, why we say the things we say. Not so I can diminish and belittle and demean those who are acting that way, but so I might be able to find a way to bring some healing into there. The quote I use at the core of my work says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, you must start by creating a common memory. Our nation is so divided. We're so messed up right now. And we've never had a healthy relationship across racial lines, across gender lines. We've never had a healthy relationship here. And I'm trying to create that. This is why I ran for president in 2020. This is why I'm advocating for a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a truth and conciliation commission. Not to cancel people, not to diminish and belittle and dismiss people. I want to create a healthy common memory so that for the very first time, we can have healthy community within our country. So I want to encourage you, my relatives, don't get sucked into the screaming, the fighting, the back and forth, the antics that both the left and the right are playing right now. Both sides refuse to look at the history. Both sides refuse to acknowledge what we've done. You don't need to win a debate with them. That's not the goal. And trying to win a debate with people who are in such a state of shock and denial is going to be counterproductive. Instead, we need to understand why they're behaving the way they behave, not to excuse it and not to justify it or even to affirm it, but to understand why they're behaving this way so that we might find a way to bring the conversation to a deeper level. By understanding what I refer to as the trauma of white America, it allowed me to develop some tools that help me keep my white audiences engaged. Because I don't want them to stay in their state of shock and denial. I can't have healthy community, healthy relationships with that in the way. So don't scream, don't yell, don't even try and win. Just keep gently but insistently talking about the truth. Keep looking for ways to help shift the paradigm, engage the conversation, take the discussion deeper, talk about the things that are behind the reasons of why we're behaving these ways. As anyone who has ever dealt with trauma and these types of issues will most likely be able to tell you, when you can get to what's at the heart of the behaviors and expose them, talk about them, discuss them, acknowledge them, that's when healing begins. That's when healing begins. And that's my goal. That's what I'm working for. That's why I'm trying to engage this. My relatives, I deeply appreciate all of you. Thank you for joining me for this cup of coffee. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine was. I appreciate all of you. I have a few things coming up. I'm going to put some events out on my social media later this week. I'm traveling to California next Sunday, and I'm going to be speaking at a church in Santa Ana, California. I will be at, let me get the name of the church here so I can tell you the exact name of the church. I'm going to be at New Song Church, which is in Santa Ana, California at 1010 West 17th Street. I'm preaching in their morning services at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. I'll be preaching on a sermon topic called Radical Inclusivity. And then at 6 o'clock that night, I'm giving my Common Memory Tour presentation there, Christian Nationalism, Creation Stories, and Corn. And I'll be speaking there. All of these events are public. They're open to the public. They're free. You're welcome to come. If you're in the Southern California area, I would love to have you come and join us for these events. I'm really excited to be there. And I'll be flying out there this coming Saturday, and I'll be there on Sunday, which is November the 2nd. And so the services are at 9 and 11 a.m. And then the evening presentation for the Common Memory Tour is going to be at 6 p.m. But my relatives, thank you for joining me today. I hope that you have a great rest of the week. It's Monday, so I hope your week goes really well. I'm hoping I'll do another second cup of coffee either Thursday or Friday this week, but we'll see how the schedule goes. But until then, my relatives, walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Yá'át'ééh and Hagseth.